95 people, including your mother, perished in that plane crash. 2 people on the ground, nearly 100 people. That's so heinous and so evil, it's almost beyond description.
It took me a long time to come to terms with this because I don't like to believe that my CIA would do this kind of thing. They would never take a whole plane down and kill all these innocent people. Well, the CIA doesn't care about the killing innocent people.
St. John Hunt is the eldest son of super spy E. Howard Hunt, CIA agent best known for his involvement in the Watergate scandal. And he is the author of a new book entitled Dorothy, the Murder of E. Howard Hunt's Wife, Watergate's Darkest Secret. Let's talk about your father's service in the CIA and meeting and working with people like G. Gordon Liddy.
Right. In 1943, my father joined the OSS after his service in the Pacific in World War II. And he was stationed in Shanghai and then Mexico and China in 1945 when the OSS was disbanded. But when he joined CIA, he was one of his first duties was stationed in Mexico City to open up the first CIA station in Mexico. And that was a good place for a lot of intelligence activity to go on because it was a hub of Latin American embassies, and all the communist countries had embassies in Mexico City. So, he was in heaven in terms of being in a location where there was a lot of access to embassies and secret files. And in '54, we moved to Tokyo, Japan, and he worked doing various things related to the Soviet embassy and also the naval air base at Atsugi. He just missed Oswald by a few months. Oswald was in Atsugi in 1958. And then he got a notice we were being transferred to Montevideo, Uruguay in 1957, and that's where he first met Vice President Richard Nixon. They had a long lunch together, and that was really the start of their relationship, which Nixon never forgot, and he called upon my father years and years later to work for him in the White House. In '59, he was summoned to Washington, D.C., where he was given the operation to go to Cuba and to assess the possibility of a overthrow of the Cuban government. And he came back and he said an invasion of Cuba would only be successful if the assassination of Fidel Castro and Raul Castro, his brother, and Che Guevara and other top military leaders were killed. And so they formed a group called Operation 40, which was established to assassinate people that the CIA felt were a threat to American national security. And Nixon greenlighted that operation, and that's one of the things years later when that Nixon feared of being revealed. And my father had evidence to bring Nixon to task on that greenlighting of Operation 40. Nixon feared that the same people that were involved in Operation 40 then turned their guns against Kennedy, and he felt that link with him would be devastating to his political career.
So, in other words, as early as the late 1950s, early 60s, there was unofficially a presidential death list. Is that what you're telling us?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm telling you. And there was another one established shortly thereafter by William Harvey, and it was his little creation, his baby, and it was the executive action capability. And that was built around much the same as Operation 40, but it had less people and it was more secret. And it used, rather than Cuban expatriates as assassins, it used Corsican underworld assassins that they found and recruited from the Corsican underworld in France.
All these activities, overthrowing duly elected officials and so forth, this was part of the Special Activities Division within the CIA, correct?
Yes, I would say that's definitely correct. And all highly illegal. I mean, the CIA was not, their purpose wasn't to murder people, and it certainly wasn't to direct foreign policy to the White House. But there we come to the time when Kennedy and the CIA were at war because the CIA was trying to muscle in, tell the White House what foreign policy should be, whereas before the White House should have been telling the CIA what foreign policy would be. So there's a lot of trouble between Kennedy and Allen Dulles, who was director of CIA.
So I'm guessing your father was no fan of Kennedy then.
Yes, he was deeply hurt by Kennedy's seeming weakness during the Bay of Pigs invasion. There was a first airstrike that Kennedy allowed to support the ground troops, the Cuban exiles of Brigade 2506, of which my father trained over in Guatemala for months and became very close with a lot of these guys. And the Cuban exiles were left stranded on the beach and in the swamps and jungles to be killed and rounded up by Castro. And my father never forgave Kennedy for that. In fact, he would have been happy to wipe out the whole family because he was just anti-Kennedy.
But I want to talk, obviously, about the events of November 22nd, 63. 5 years later, of course, Garrison claims that your father, along with Frank Sturgis and one other, one of the so-called three transients apprehended near Dealey Plaza in the boxcars, were somehow involved in the assassination. But your father would, in his deathbed confession, sort of reveal his role in the Kennedy assassination. Let's start that conversation now, and then we'll discuss afterwards as well. What did he tell you about where he was and what he was supposed to be doing?
He said that in the summer of 1963, he had been asked to come to a meeting in a safe house in Miami. At this meeting was Frank Sturgis, who had worked with him during the Bay of Pigs, Antonio Veciana, who was head of the most violent anti-Castro group called Alpha 66, whose case officer was David Atlee Phillips. And in that relation, Veciana handled Lee Harvey Oswald, and David Atlee Phillips handled Oswald in that summer before the assassination. Also at the meeting was David Morales, who was one of the heads of the Miami CIA station called JM Wave. That was the code word for the Miami station. And these are all Operation 40 guys. The CIA officers involved were David Atlee Phillips, as I mentioned, and William Harvey, who was Operation 40. And so at this meeting, they were discussing this assassination of a American politician here in this country. And after some discussion of the people in attendance, my father said, well, let's cut to the chase. Who are we talking about here, and why do you want me here? And they said, Frank Sturgis turned to him and said, well, we're talking about killing that son of a bitch Kennedy. And my father said he was incredulous at this notion. But, of course, being a Kennedy hater, he didn't really have a problem with it. He asked who else was involved, and they went on to say that William Harvey recruited to be part of this plan. And that makes total sense, although my father said that Harvey was a psycho and an alcoholic, and that anything he was involved in at this point in his career should be taken with serious reservations. Harvey, as a matter of fact, had been instrumental in creating this secret program in 1959 for false defectors to the Soviet Union. Now, that happens to be the year that Oswald defected to the Soviet Union, and there's much evidence, I believe, that he was part of this Harvey program for false defectors to the Soviet Union. And Oswald himself, he had a low-level security clearance, enough to perhaps whet the taste of the Soviets into allowing him to emigrate to the Soviet Union, and then Oswald, of course, was acting as a double agent. And the other thing Harvey was involved in was the creation of this executive action, which was another assassination squad, but using Corsicans. And this was as a result of Harvey's war with RFK, because Harvey was continuing to do anti-Castro warfare against Cuba at a time when Kennedy brothers were swearing to Khrushchev that they were not involved in anti-Castro activities. So when RFK found out about Harvey's activities, he demoted Harvey and sent him to be substation chief in Rome. And that's where he got the idea they should use others than the Cubans for the assassination squad. And he said not even Sicilians would do because they could be traced back through the American mafia. So he went to France and recruited a couple of Corsican underworld characters, one of whom was a guy named Michael Mertz, who used the false name of Lucien Sarté at the scene in Dallas. And that was because he was one of Harvey's guys. So my father said that, what do you need me for? It looks like you guys have things kind of worked out on your own. And Sturgis and Morales said, Howard, you're somebody we trust. You've got a lot of credibility. And we need you there to take a look at this whole plan and kind of point out its weaknesses and point out its strength and do what you can to streamline it and help us through it. And that's as far as we got on that. That's why he told me he was a bench warmer.
Did he give you an indication how many shooters there were besides Sardi and where they were positioned?
Yeah, he said there was a shooter on the 6th floor. He didn't say who that shooter was, and he only surmised that it was Sarté on the grassy knoll. He didn't talk about any additional shooters, although I firmly believe it was 3 shooters, a triple action going on. And some people think that that was on the Dow Tex building behind the Olympics.
Well, they did find a shell casing up there on the roof, didn't they?
That's what I heard, yeah. And so it all fits in. I mean, standard CIA triangulation assassination, because you got 3 is the working number, and 2, just, you're taking your chances. You're going to put an operation like that together. You need to do the best you can. There were so many people that wanted Kennedy gone. I mean, certainly Johnson's only hope of becoming president was to agree to have Kennedy eliminated. Now, my father did tell me that LBJ was at the top of the chain of command. He wrote in his own handwriting. This is all documented in my first book called Bond of Secrecy, which LBJ was at the top. And he said that basically all LBJ had to do was just green light it, that there was not going to be a problem coming from the White House about the assassination of Kennedy. And, of course, Hoover was involved, my father said, but he didn't write Hoover's name down. And all Hoover had to do was just get a hold of the evidence, which he did, and move it to Washington, D.C., so it could be under FBI control, under Hoover's control. And, of course, that's exactly what happened. So it didn't take very many conspirators. Under LBJ, there was David Atlee Phillips and William Harvey. Phillips handled Oswald, but Harvey brought in the Corsican shooter that was at the grassy knoll. And my father being there on that afternoon to act as an overseer, I think that one picture of him it could be definitely him. He was dressed up in his hat and his overcoat. He was down India Lee Plaza in the middle of the action, and I think that would be exactly where he would be. There's testimony from an aviator, a pilot for CIA in the Miami station, that he flew my father to Dallas that day for a few hours. There's also evidence that he had taken 11 hours sick leave from the CIA on that day. And of course, the excuse that he was at home with the kids didn't pan out because he wasn't at home. He doesn't go shopping for food, and he doesn't cook our meals for us. We had people that lived there that cooked and shopped and did those things for us. So that was a pretty weak defense.
When did you first start to become aware of what your father did for a living?
Not until my parents called me into the living room and told me to sit down, and they had something important to tell me, and I had no idea, what it was they were going to say. But they told me that my father, in fact, wasn't working for the State Department, never had been, but he had been working for the CIA. And I was too young. I was 16 years old. I didn't know what the CIA meant. And they explained it was kind of like the FBI, but not doing anti-criminal work in this country. It was abroad in Europe and Latin America. And they said that's why we moved around so much. But to me, moving around every couple of years was the normal thing to do. Every family's moved around every 2 years. So it was even later on when Watergate broke in 1972 that I realized how deep all this would be and what a catastrophic effect it had on the country and our family.
What was it like? I mean, was there any normalcy in the house? Did your father, overthrow a Central American dictator and then make it home in time for dinner and make small talk? I mean, how did that work?
Yeah, he did from time to time. When I realizing, the timing sequence when we were in Mexico or Spain or whatnot, he did come home in the middle of operations briefly and stayed a day or two. And then we'd have dinner, and that seemed normal in itself because we were used to him not really being around very much. He was deeply focused on his projects with the CIA, and he firmly believed that these activities were necessary for the security of the country. And conversations with him many years later in the early 2000s, I asked him, how he could justify the murder of over 40,000 persons when the Guatemalan coup went down, and he said that's just collateral damage, and he didn't think anything of it at all. Also, he had no guilt or remorse about the Kennedy assassination, none at all. And in fact, I heard him say several times we should kill Ted just to get rid of the 3 brothers, and he was serious.
What was your relationship like with your father? Was he aloof? Was he cold? Were you close? Tell me about that.
It was complex. My father had high hopes for me as his firstborn son, and he expected me to be a good student and to do well in sports, and then to graduate high school and then go on to a good college, become a lawyer, or even join the CIA or something. And I couldn't have been more different than that. I was definitely not that type of material. I was thin. I had double vision. I stuttered. I had born with a club foot, so I wasn't very sports-like. But and so there was this constant feeling in myself that I was never living up to his expectations. And he made it very clear that he expected me to follow suit, and that he was disappointed that I was less than what he had hoped for. And that was a cruel thing. But my father could be incredibly cruel in just the shortest amount of time. He could say something that cut you down, just reduced you to nothing, pretty much. And at the same time, we shared some wonderful times. My father was a musician also. He played piano and trumpet. And as I started writing songs when I was 9, he spent a good deal of time with me transferring my music onto note paper, musical notation. And he did that by ear. He had a natural ear. And if I said, well, hum a C note or an F sharp note, he would do it, and it would be dead on. So, and he introduced me to jazz. He took me to some blues clubs in D.C. when I was underage, when I was 16 and 17. And I saw some of the last great big band jazz musicians play at this little club, and I'll never forget that. That was just an awesome experience. So we did share some really good things through music, but generally speaking, he was aloof and a difficult man to deal with.
But tell me about your dad's role in Watergate. Was it simply a botched break-in, or was there something else afoot here?
Watergate, 1972. I was awoken by my father very, very early in the morning after he came back from the Watergate complex there in D.C. And I didn't know anything about anything he was doing, but he comes into my room. I was the only other person in the house besides him. And he's not looking well, and he tells me to come upstairs to his room immediately after I get dressed, which I did. He had 2 suitcases on the bed, and he instructed me to get some gloves and some detergent or some spray cleaner and come in and take everything out of the suitcases and wipe down everything, including the inside of the suitcases and all the things in the suitcases, which were a lot of wires and black boxes, wiretapping stuff, and film cameras and things like that. We threw it in the back of his 1970 Pontiac Firebird. An hour or two later, drove out to the canal and threw him in. And in the next couple of days, I helped him transfer large amounts of cash from banks in D.C., and I was told to keep my eye out in the rearview mirror for anybody following me, and stash money in the house, in the basement, in the place that he had built in the ceiling there. And, of course, then the papers, everything started talking about Watergate, so I knew that whatever I was doing for him seemed to be related to this Watergate that had been starting to appear on the front pages. He was in a bad way. He and my mother, who had never argued before, started arguing when my father told her that he had decided he was going to work in the White House for Charles Colson, who was one of Nixon's top counsels, and he was going to be involved in this internal White House investigation unit, which they dubbed the Plumbers, because one of their first operations was to find how the leaks of the Pentagon Papers, which was a study commissioned by the Defense Department about the history of the Vietnam War, was being leaked by Daniel Ellsberg to the New York Times. And Nixon was furious about that, and he requested my father personally. Even before the New York Times leaks of the Pentagon Papers, Nixon had wanted the Brookings Institute, which is a think tank in D.C., to be burglarized and ransacked to find this dossier that Fidel Castro had made of the many, many attempts on his life, and all of them linked to the CIA. And so he said, we need somebody who can do that. I know a man, his name is Howard Hunt. And so they went off and looked for Howard Hunt, who was very happy to join the Nixon White House, although my mother had begged him not to, and that caused a lot of problems in the house. But it was his team, and it was, as you said, made up of many of the same members involved in the Bay of Pigs. And these were all guys that were part of this Operation 40 group, this assassination squad. And that's the one Kennedy was referring to when he found out about the Operation 40. He said, "We're running a damn Murder Incorporated in the Caribbean," and that's when he threatened to break the CIA up into, splinter it into 1,000 pieces and cast it to the wind. And he did fire some of the top CIA guys. You know, that was the threat Kennedy made, and that was one of the reasons why he had to be eliminated. But up in Watergate times, Nixon, and his top guys, John Mitchell, the Attorney General, and Charles Colson and Eagle Krogh and Haldeman and Ehrlichman, all those guys, they put my father to good use. They developed a huge plan to bug the Democrats and do all kinds of crazy things to them prior to the election. And so they named each of these missions a different name. Semi-precious stone, for example, Sapphire was to establish a houseboat filled with prostitutes as a honey trap during the Democratic convention. They would lure Democrats there, film them, give them drugs, and then blackmail them. Turquoise was an operation do commando raids and destroy the air conditioning at the Democratic convention, so it would be unbearably hot. Just really crazy stuff like that. And they did a lot of that stuff. They broke into Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office looking for incriminating evidence against Daniel Ellsberg, who leaked the Pentagon Papers, as we were just talking about, to see if he was a pervert of some kind. They had spies that had infiltrated the organizations of the Democratic contenders. And another thing they had asked my father to do was break into Arthur Bremer's apartment in Milwaukee after he shot a presidential hopeful, George Wallace, and plant pro-McGovern literature in his apartment.
Oh my!
I mean, what are they thinking? Is that really gonna change somebody's way of voting? If they find out that Arthur Bremer was a McGovern person, I mean, would they go, "Oh, well, I'm not voting for McGovern now"? I mean, it really gets bizarre. But Nixon put this team together. My father put the team together, but Nixon had my father, come in for the reason because the FBI and the CIA refused to help Nixon do these things. FBI Hoover just refused, and CIA and Nixon were already having a war with each other. Nixon had dirt on Helms, the director of CIA, and Helms had dirt on Nixon, and Nixon was demanding all the files about the Bay of Pigs and such, and Helms was just stalling and stonewalling and not giving him the files. So
here we have some pretty accomplished, slick operatives sort of caught red-handed trying to break into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate Hotel. It's almost as if they were meant to get caught, as if this was another type of assassination, very different than Dealey Plaza, but another way of bringing a president down, and that is sort of a character assassination. What do you think of that? I mean, why did they get caught so easily?
Well, I think what you said is very true. I think what happened was, we now know that my father did not actually retire from the CIA, but still was working for the CIA under deeper cover. And he was giving information on a weekly basis directly to CIA Director Dick Helms. Two of the other Watergate burglars, one was actually on the payroll, still on the payroll of CIA, and he was reporting back to his case officer about the events and things they were doing, the breaking and enterings and all the plans that they had going on. And two of the others had been contract agents. Bernard Barker and Eugenio Martinez were both contract assets for the CIA. So this definitely reeked of a CIA involvement. And I think Helms knew that although Nixon didn't specifically direct the Watergate break-in, that once it was found out by the public, that Nixon would immediately go into a cover-up mode. And it's the cover-up that brought him down, not the crime itself. And I think, and that's exactly what happened. This was their third entry into Watergate. The first two had been successful, except one of the bugs wasn't functioning right. And they were told to go on a third time and fix the bug. But it's odd because most of the major activity for the Democrats had been moved down to Miami, where the convention was going to be held. So the offices there in D.C., in the Watergate complex, were a little more than a skeleton crew of workers. And there were several reasons, several operations going on at the same time that each of the Watergate burglars, the defendants, were involved in. My father was there for one specific reason, and apparently James McCord was there for another reason. And Martinez was there for even a third reason. I mean, they were looking for a book with the names of prominent politicians that used this call girl circle that apparently was linked to John Dean's wife. They were looking for evidence of donations to the Democrats coming or originating from communist sympathizers. They were looking for the file, the dossier that Nixon thought was in the Brookings Institute, naming the CIA and all these operations to kill Castro. And so it was very confusing, but the whole thing came down with a piece of tape on the door, very unprofessional. And so they were became known as bungling burglars, and it was really a sad way for my dad to go out because he was anything but a bungling burglar. But it just seemed like it was doomed from the start, that third entry. It just wasn't, there was nothing being produced from the original bugs in there that was of any real value. Definitely a setup.
Right. Your father's relationship with Nixon. Your father obviously had goods on Nixon, this assassination team that could be linked back to Nixon and perhaps its involvement in the Kennedy assassination. Why did Nixon bring your father into the fold? Was it a question of keeping your enemies closer?
I don't think he viewed my dad as an enemy at that point. I think it was one of the few names that he knew directly of someone who was trustworthy, someone who knew the deeper and darker side of intelligence work, and that had proven himself in the field as a very slick and capable operative. And so when he was looking for a team to break into Brookings and to break in the Chilean embassy in Washington, D.C. also, because there was some thought that this dossier could be found in their embassy. And so that's a little-known break-in that my father did. You know, they had weird assignments, like they were trying to figure. They thought, Nixon wanted Jack Anderson eliminated, and so Gordon Liddy, in his mind, when you say eliminated, he was thinking murder. So my father and Gordon Liddy were concocting various plans to kill a journalist, Jack Anderson, who was a prominent investigative journalist for the Washington Post, I think. A lot of very crazy things.
How did they meet? How did your parents meet?
She had a job in the Treasury Department, and she was stationed in Bern, Switzerland, working under Alan Dulles, who was the OSS chief of operations there in Bern. And she worked in a program directed by Dulles called Safe Haven, and that was a joint undertaking by State Department and Treasury Department to find and block the flow of Nazi assets through Europe. So conversations I had with my mother, it seemed like a very glamorous thing. I could imagine her traipsing around Europe, after hidden Nazi loot that they, confiscated from the countries that they were rolling over. And so she was already into some level of intelligence by doing that. And then when the OSS took control of Safe Haven, they took control away from State Department and Treasury Department, she just blended right in. And then she was stationed in Shanghai, recruiting low-level operatives of foreign embassies into being double agents for the OSS. She met my dad when she was transferred to Paris and worked in the Organization of European Economic Cooperation, which was the venture to rebuild Europe after its near total destruction because of World War II. And she worked for Averell Harriman, who was head of the OEEC. And my father happened to be working for Averell Harriman at the same time as his speechwriter and filmmaker. And so they met and dated, and then in 1949 they decided to get married. In 1949 also, she was in Shanghai early in 49 and was on the last train out of Shanghai while the communist forces under Mao were encircling the city, and it was a bad time. If she had been caught on that train, she would have been yanked off of there and raped to death probably. So she had got a little .25 caliber pistol that she kept with her, and she was dressed in peasant clothes. And she met my dad, and they married, and they started having kids. And so her work in the intelligence field took a second role to being a housewife and a mother to our ever-growing family. But she still stayed, one foot in the door because she worked at embassies in the different host countries that we were stationed at. And she would be available to take secret cables out of the embassies, give them to my dad to copy and so forth if the CIA needed those cables or something. So she was always involved. And of course, later on, as I mentioned before, that in 1970 they argued quite a lot about his work for the White House. She was convinced that this was not a good thing to do, that the people he was working for couldn't be trusted, and she was right. You know, she saw it ahead of anybody else. When she came back from Europe that summer in '72, Watergate was full blown all across the papers. There was news people around our house, and it was a very stressful time. And she became the person that picked up the money that the White House, Nixon, was providing to the defendants. They would be, of course, my father and Gordon Liddy's family and the McCord family and the Cubans, the families of the 4 Cubans that were all arrested. We needed money, and we needed a lot of it for expenses, lawyer payments, and just to continue running the different households, mortgages.
Hush money? Was it hush money, essentially?
Hush money. Yes, it was hush money, and it was blackmail money. My father felt that it was money that was justly due to him and his team, because in the CIA, if you were caught by the enemy, your family would be taken care of. And I don't know if that meant taken care of like killed or taken care of like paid. Their expenses and their lives would be continued to be supported by CIA. But nevertheless, the White House balked at first. They didn't want to pay, but Nixon ranted, and you can hear the tapes, the Watergate tapes, about having to pay off Hunt because Hunt knew too much. Nixon, you can hear him ranting and saying, you open up that scab, and there's going to be a lot of people that are going to be upset. It's not going to look good for the CIA, not going to look good for Hunt. And Nixon's top guys, Ehrlichman and Haldeman, Dean, and those people didn't understand what Nixon meant when he said that it all came back to the whole Bay of Pigs thing. Of course, later on it became obvious that Nixon was using the term Bay of Pigs thing as a thinly veiled reference to the Kennedy assassination. You know, they had sent letters and phone conversations with direct threats against Nixon in the White House, saying that they had evidence that would put Nixon in jail and would blow the lid off Watergate, because at that time nobody really knew the extent of Watergate, and certainly nobody knew that Nixon approved of Operation 40 back in 1960. And that's they had cashier's checks cashed through a Mexican bank that directly linked money coming from Nixon's money chest for his re-election that financed the Watergate break-in and all the other stuff they were doing. And this is what she had on the plane, took off from D.C. and flew to Chicago. Now, they knew she was on that plane. She had been picking up money from these dark and dangerous areas, let's say Greyhound bus station in D.C. She'd go to a phone in Potomac about 8-10 miles from our house, and I went with her on 2 occasions. When the phone rang and she got out of the car and answered the phone, and she would write a few things down or just nod her head and hang up. We'd go back to the house, and then she'd say she had to leave, and she'd go to where she was instructed to go to from the phone conversation, and there'd be a key taped under a phone booth, which would correspond to a locker in the part of the Greyhound station or the airport even. And in the locker would be a satchel or a bag that had cash in it. She'd come home and we'd count the cash, and she said she was being followed. She said that she feared for her life, and she was just completely fed up with the whole thing.
Excuse me, St. John, but why would your father have enlisted your mother in the mother of his children, into such a perilous role?
There was nobody else that he could trust. And she, her being involved in intelligence work in the past, he just called upon her. And the tragic thing about it all is that when she came back from Europe that summer, she was planning to kick my father out of the house and divorce him because she was fed up with everything. And she looked forward to a life without him and with her children. And instead, the courageous woman that she was, she helped my father, and it cost her her life. That plane was, the crash was so suspicious. The reason that they brought the plane down was because it was imminent that my mother was going to call a press conference with another passenger on that plane named Michelle Clark, who was a top CBS, actually the first CBS anchor woman in their organization. And she and my mother had agreed to call a press conference where my mother was going to blow the lid off Watergate and just bring Nixon effectively to the end of his career at that point. And that's why they that plane had to go down.
Was it on approach, I guess, to Chicago Midway International Airport?
Taking a plane down is a classic CIA, tactic for diffusing a murder of somebody. People have said, they would never take a whole plane down and kill all these innocent people. Well, the CIA doesn't care about the killing innocent people. That's just part of the whole process they use to hide the actual murder that they intended. It's a great cover, because if they just killed her by herself, the investigation would focus on my mother. But you bring a whole plane down, and then the investigation is so broad and diffused that a lot of things can be masked behind a crash like that.
95 people, including your mother, perished in that plane crash. 2 people on the ground, nearly 100 people. And the target were your mother and one other individual. That's so heinous and so evil, it's almost beyond description.
That's what's so hard about this whole thing to deal with, is that we have to admit that the intelligence arm of the American government has been doing this kind of thing for a long, long time, and they just continue to get away with it, time and time again. This started coming out in the Church Committee investigation in 1975, when it was first learned and made public that the CIA had these assassination squads, and that they had influenced the deaths of several foreign dignitaries and freely elected officials, but they were never brought to task. And of course, by the time Bush Senior became president, and certainly director of CIA for that year, that was the common way to do things. You invade a country, you kill people, you freeze, banking assets, and you take the money. And the whole drug business revolves around getting money for the CIA. That's the way they can fund all this stuff, because if they went to Congress, they really wanted to do, I would hope that Congress would deny it, like they did in the Iran-Contra scandal. They denied Reagan to finance the Contras, and he just went around them and the drugs and brought them up here and sold them. The whole crack epidemic.
The official cause was pilot error, but,
Yeah.
obviously the evidence points elsewhere. Tell me where your investigation and others have led in terms of the downing of Flight 553.
First of all, the pilot, Wendell Whitehouse, was the most decorated United Airlines pilot in their roster of pilots. He had literally had tens of thousands of hours of flight time. So to blame it on him is just a miscarriage completely. But the couple of things that you have to look at initially that I did was the actions that happened directly at the time of the flight. First of all, the very next day, that flight crashed December 8th, and by the morning of December 9th, President Nixon, after he was informed of the crash by Charles Colson, to appoint one of his counselors to Undersecretary of Transportation. That just seems like a wild thing to do. Why would you do that in the morning of the next day after the crash? Well, the Undersecretary of Transportation oversees the NTSB, which is the National Transportation and Safety Board, which investigated that crash. So here you have, less than 24 hours later, Nixon with his grip over that investigation. Shortly thereafter, he appointed Alexander Butterfield, another of his top lawyers and special counsels to the president, to administrator of the Federal Aviation Administration, which also was a governing body over the NTSB. So, he's got two guys able to control where the investigation was going and the final report of NTSB. Thirdly, within 40 minutes of that accident, the FBI had 50 FBI agents on the ground. Some went to the tower at Midway and confiscated the recording between the tower and the cockpit and the crew. That's completely against NTSB and FBI protocol. Matter of fact, the FBI does not have jurisdiction in crashes. That's up to the NTSB to interview people. The FBI also, with their agents, also interviewed some of the people on the ground, the witnesses, and they seem to be trying to control the scene of the crash. And a lot of people have said, no, that's not possible. The FBI can't get 50 people to one location in 40 minutes, and that's true. They can't, unless they had prior knowledge that something was going to happen to that flight. That is the only way that 50 FBI agents could arrive at the scene within 40 minutes, considering the closest FBI office in Chicago was 45 minutes away.
Where did this investigation lead? You suspected that it was a bomb.
It ended up the determination that was a pilot error, no discussion of the events surrounding it. For example, John Reed, who was the head of the NTSB, National Transportation and Safety Board, investigating that crash, wrote a letter to FBI Director William Ruckelshaus asking on what grounds did the FBI have for coming to that crash and for investigating the crash and for confiscating the tape of the tower and interrogating witnesses and so forth. In the response back, FBI Director Ruckelshaus said that, in fact, the FBI does have primary investigation in connection with the destruction of aircraft pertaining to willful damaging, destroying, or disabling of any civilian aircraft, aircraft piracy, interference with flight crew, assault, murder, manslaughter, and attempts to commit murder or manslaughter. And so that's very disturbing that the FBI had prior knowledge that something was happening on that flight. Maybe they even knew exactly what was going to happen to that flight, that it was brought down. But there was enough outcry of conspiracy and murder that the NTSB agreed to do a second investigation, at which time several notable journalists and reporters questioned the official findings, but nothing ever came of it. The fact that the Midway Tower had directed a small two-propeller plane directly in the path of the big United Airlines 737 just minutes before the crash is one of the most telling events that brought that plane down. The outer marker lights were turned off on the runway, so the visibility was only a mile or two. The controls in the cockpit were popping and like sparking. They were shorting out for some reason. All of a sudden, the plane was just unable to lift its nose to get back up and do a return. So, there was a lot of things going on the ground that confused the pilots. They were being told conflicting directions by both Midway and O'Hare Airport. The handover between one tower and another is supposed to be quick, direct, and with explicit instructions, but this handover was very blurry, and they were directing the plane to go to runway 31 left, and then another said, 31 right, and this speed should be attained at that altitude. But they brought the plane in so low, and then they moved this other two-propeller smaller plane directly in front of it. The big plane stalled out and crashed, killing a lot of people. It took me a long time to come to terms with this because I don't like to believe that my CIA would do this kind of thing or whoever. I can't name who the conspirators were in this or the people responsible, but I certainly know that it prevented my father from revealing what he knew about the JFK assassination and Nixon's potential involvement in that. Less than a week after my mother was killed, he pled guilty to all the charges and kept his mouth shut for damn near the rest of his life.
You mentioned earlier Chuck Colson, who was Nixon's special counsel, and I believe not too long after that plane crash, he did an interview with Time magazine, and he also intimated in the interview that the CIA may have been involved in bringing down that plane.
Yeah, he said he thought the CIA murdered Dorothy Hunt. And I spoke with Mr. Colson after my father passed away. I was able to get in touch with him through his prison ministry company, and we spoke briefly on the phone, and he talked about how good of a man my father was and that kind of thing. And then I asked him about the Time article and the quote that he said about my mother being killed by the CIA. And he said that all he was going to say about that was that he stood by that quote, but he wasn't going to give me any more information for my safety and for his safety. And that was it. So he knew something. He definitely knew something.
I want to talk about your mother in a more personal light, and that is, you detailed the rather frosty relationship you had with your father, E. Edward Hunt. What was your relationship like with your mother, Dorothy?
Oh, it was amazing, especially in the year prior to her death. I was now a young man, and I was able to, we were able to relate on a completely different level than when I was younger. And we spent a lot of time riding our horses in the fields and pastures in and around Potomac, and that's when she started pouring out about certain events in her life, her experiences with OSS, and time in Shanghai, and also the fact that she and my father were at odds over this White House thing, and she was angry that my father had used me to commit crimes to help cover up his involvement in Watergate in the first 3 or 4 days after his team had been arrested. I just found out a lot about my mother, what a deeply committed person she was to her children, and also how sad her life had been in the last 10 years because my father had been unfaithful, and for a number of reasons. She was tired of the whole CIA precedent over everything else. But she was a remarkable woman. She was gifted. She was a multilinguist. She was, according to John Dean, he told Nixon that Dorothy Hunt was the savviest woman in the world. She had the whole picture together. And Colson, of course, is quoted as saying how my mother was a beautiful and smooth operator and the rock of Gibraltar for our family. They seem to know something about her, that she was both capable and deadly. I mean, some of her things she did in OSS, involved being like a honey trap, getting a foreign agent and recruiting them from after the use of blackmail, putting them in a compromising position and that kind of thing. So she was quite advanced. I think she was ahead of a lot of women. I think women can look up to her as a role model and as someone that did their best in a pre-femininist world. When women really didn't have anything to say or were told not to say anything. She was ahead of her time because she's having a war with the president of the United States, Nixon. That's got to come out badly for anybody. You don't have a war that you think you're going to win. I don't think she thought she was going to win it, but I think certainly she felt that flight she was on could be her last.
Must have felt trapped in many ways. I get the sense that working for the company was like working for the mob. Once you get in, there's no getting out. And I mean, her loyalties must have been devastating, knowing she had young children at home who needed her, and yet she was sort of helping to cover your father's tracks and Nixon's tracks and caught up in this whole world, knowing that it could cost her life and maybe even yours.
Yeah, well, and my father, years later, when we were doing what became known as his deathbed confession, he confided to me for the first time that our mother was murdered. He said he always felt she was, but he never would have wanted to say that. But when he went to prison, he said, I couldn't protect you children, meaning that the next threat would have been our safety, his kids. And that's why he kept his mouth shut for so many years. And basically, until he died, he'd always denied the Kennedy assassination involvement and all that stuff. But I got him to give a final hurrah to set the record straight, and unfortunately we just didn't have enough time to get the whole story out. But the fact that he did confess of prior knowledge and of general involvement in the death of Kennedy, and he also said that there were several teams. It wasn't just the one team that he knew about. There was other teams. There was a Chicago team. There was a Tampa team. They had him slated to be killed. There was no doubt about that.
I want to ask you, this is a tough question, but did you blame your father for your mother's death?
It didn't really occur to me to blame him. My sisters did, but at the time I just didn't think that I didn't put all the pieces together until a few years later, and then I did blame him for a number of years, but came to terms with that and forgave him for everything that he did. He was only trying to do the best he could, and I don't think he had any real idea that they would use force that they used to keep him under control, which is kind of odd because him being so close to CIA assassination groups, why wouldn't he think that they would go to any extreme to protect their secrets? I think that was a lacking on his part to really look at the big picture. But when she died, that was a wake-up call for him. I did blame him for a number of years, but I forgave him, and we rekindled our relationship in the late 90s, and that kept us very close to each other all the way until his death in 2007.
How did the deathbed confessions, as they're called, come about? Did you approach him, or did he say, I need to get some things off my chest? How did that happen?
Well, it was a little of both. I had heard when I visited the family in Miami that there was this crazy episode where Kevin Costner had flown down and he had made an appointment with my father. And Costner walks in the house, and within 5 minutes he just blurts out, so who killed Kennedy? This is in front of my dad and his second wife that he married. On the film side of the Nixon movie, that Oliver Stone had flown my dad up there to act as a technical advisor. And during the course of this lavish meal, Stone looks at my dad and goes, so how much money would it take to get you to talk about the Kennedy assassination? My dad calmly said, about $3 million. And that was the end of that. But he did reach out to me and said, because he thought he was dying, he was in the hospital, he'd had gangrene, he had his leg chopped twice, and he had a number of other problems, and he didn't think he was going to make it. So I flew down there, and he said he needed to get some things off, his chest, and he said that there was truth that he had been knowledgeable of the Kennedy assassination. And so on my next trip there, we agreed to if we could talk about it to each other, then we would try to put together a package for publishers. So he would be able to write his autobiography before he died, telling the truth about the Kennedy assassination as well as a lot of other things. And that's how it got started. Then we reached out to Costner because he seemed so interested in it. But when it came down to it, Costner was unwilling to deposit any substantial amount of cash into a bank account as a good faith gesture. He just wanted to fly my dad and myself out to Los Angeles and for $100 a day stipend. And I said to Mr. Costner, I said, "Are you kidding? The flight alone could kill him. That's insulting. $100 a day? Come on. If you want my dad to talk about this, he's put a dollar value on it, as he should. He's a guy that knows a lot about a lot of things that should be told about."
Let me ask you then straight out, after hearing your father refusing to, no contrition in terms of the innocents killed in Guatemala, the deaths of the Kennedy brothers, when you're looking at your father, you're thinking, my gosh, this man is a sociopath, but this is my father? I mean, how do you reconcile that?
Yeah. My dad was proud of his career, and these are exactly the kind of people that the CIA pick, that they can separate the collateral damage that they cause from their minds. They show no remorse or guilt. That's kind of a sociopathic ability to do that, but that certainly makes the best agents, because if you had agents with guilt or remorse, they wouldn't be able to be very good agents. So, they put you through a lot of tests to determine if you can do your job.
You think the CIA has changed? Is it worse? Has anything changed in the last 50 years?
I don't think so. I think it remained the same, and certainly it's gotten worse, because now the CIA, starting with George Bush, Nixon tried to use national security as a cover for the Watergate burglary, and people just Congress just was not going to hear any part of it. But then when you get George W. Bush being asked by a news person that what do you have to say about Congress wanting you to testify in relation to some of the activities, Bush just looks at them and goes, "I don't testify."